Yours is live.
Good. Hello.
Hello. There.
Hi. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Manuel. Oh, nice to meet you. Sergio. From Costa Rica.
Oh, great. Cool. Perfect. So the session will begin in. a few
Yeah, I
minutes.
heard that it's running late.
A little bit.
Chris.
Yeah.
Well, no problem.
Yeah.
Hi there. Julie, I'm Sergio. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Where are you from?
Costa Rica.
Oh, everything is transmitted live here.
Yeah, I should turn up the volume because otherwise it goes double.
Yeah. You mean my volume?
Yeah.
Or the-
No,
okay.
no, yours because otherwise
Yeah,
it records.
Okay. But yeah. Okay, perfect. I updated the video on Twitch.
Okay, thanks.
Fine. So there were also no views on the old one.
No views?
You should entice more people to come to this one. Otherwise, the speaker won't feel
my
very.
room is over there, so
Oh.
the people come to my room.
Well, otherwise, the speaker here won't be as happy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, if not, you get a private session.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, it's working. Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you.
Some people coming in now.
Everybody's now moving?
Yeah, we're moving around. Okay, slowly. Okay, go down. I'll give you your name tag. And can you share from the original?
So congratulations on winning. What was your proposal?
Ours is called municipal adaptation strategy to climate change.
Ah, nice.
And basically, what we are trying to do is to engage a multi-stakeholder participatory process to address or create a locally strategy where we address water and agriculture issues, which are the more pressing issues right now in one particular county. We are from the university, so the idea is that we're going to facilitate the process.
Wow.
Uh,
It's about water
and
saving.
it's about agricultural practices, and so into that goes water as well.
Yeah, I see.
Um,
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
As soon as we turn back and turn on the
I
projector.
have to read your proposal.
So,
yeah.
if you have any other questions, I can help you. You can text me. right, then have a good time and thanks for being.
This is fine. Whatever is easier for you. Cool.
See?
Forget it, no, I understand.
See, correct.
I'm not gonna forget it.
Terrific. Thank you. This is loud. That's all good.
So if we have other speakers, use this microphone.
Okay, you can just remind me if I miss it. So I am Chris Warshoff from the MIT Political Science Department. I'm going to give you what I hope will be a relatively short presentation, just to sort of kick off the conversation and give you sort of some of my views on why the climate problem is so hard to solve politically.
Can I ask you a question before you start?
Sure.
Did you have to change your presentation after the election yesterday?
No, I think that this problem is hard, you know, regardless of which party has sort of a bare majority in Washington, it's a hard problem to solve. I made no changes to the presentation as a result of the election yesterday, for better or for worse. I would love to hear, just before we get started though, like who you guys are, you know, where you're from, and what brought you here. I know you all won this amazing competition, but aside from that, I don't know if we could just go around quickly and maybe just have everybody introduce themselves. If you guys all know each other, but yeah, can you kick us off?
Sudhir and I are from Climate Change Elementary.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a political science major, and so I'm
Terrific.
interested in hearing what you have to say. And I also work with the Environmental Film Festival in DC and after the last year.
Great, so you're based in DC.
Yes.
Great. Great.
I'm Sergio Molina from the National University of Costa Rica, and I'm the environmental natural resource economics area.
Great.
I'm Joe Robertson. I'm with Citizens Climate Lobby. We organize local groups of volunteers to work as teams and lobby their legislators.
Terrific.
Being around.
Terrific, thanks for your work. Hey, we're just going around everybody introducing, doing a quick introduction of what organization you're from or where you're from and who you are. Wonderful.
And I teach environmental education.
Wonderful, glad you're here.
I'm Tom Mano, I'm from Dallas, Texas, and I'm interested in the whole climate change issue and what needs to be done and how we can make some progress.
Great.
Hi, James D'Angelo. What was I supposed to say?
Just where you're from, or what, you know, what organization you're from, or where you're from geographically, whatever seems pertinent.
I'm from a mile away or something, Brookline, Massachusetts.
Oh.
I'm not part of an organization.
Great. Well, I'm excited to meet all of you, and I'm excited to hear more about your proposals. And I think my role here, although somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, is to try to help you workshop your proposals, particularly on sort of thinking through the political feasibility and to actually engage with the policy process. So I should say my research at MIT is mostly not on climate and energy. I do a little bit of work on climate and energy. The broader part of my research is on representation in elections. So it's how public opinion gets translated into public policy, which I think is one of the key issues on climate change, where a majority of the public typically supports relatively strong action on climate. So one of the key questions here is, why is it that doesn't translate into policy? Which is broadly in line with a lot of the work I do in a wide array of policy areas. I should also say, by introduction, I teach a class at MIT on the politics of the public policy process, which again is not just about climate change, but hopefully that gives me a sense of some material across the wide array of policy areas that I can draw on today. So just to give you a preview of the talk that I'm going to give you, I'm going to talk about a number of the aspects, basically, of why, in my view, the climate problem is hard to solve. Not so much on the science end. I mean, you guys probably know as much or more about that as I do. Particularly on the political end. You know, why is it that we can't just pass legislation or pass strong policy that deals with this problem? So the first issue I'm going to talk about is public opinion and collective action problems. So what does public opinion look like on climate? How does it break down across demographic or party lines? And then what are some barriers for that translating into action? Second, I'll talk a little bit about the legislative process, which will start with a little bit of like American Government 101, but hopefully will be a little bit more nuanced than that of why I think it's hard to pass legislation, particularly in the United States, on climate. Then third, I'll expand beyond the United States and talk about the international policy process. And I'm going to do a particular focus on sort of why is it that national interests diverge that make it so hard to actually reach an agreement on climate through the United Nations treaty process. Then finally, I'll offer a couple ideas or thoughts on paths forward and sort of strengths and weaknesses of different paths, none of which I'm sure are nearly as innovative as the work that you guys are doing. So I will hopefully end with a reasonable time that we can have a conversation about your ideas for next steps. So what does public opinion on climate look like? So this graph is based on some data that the Pew Foundation put together. They do a lot of polling work on climate in the United States.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just our virtual hasn't started yet, so.
Ah,
No, it's running? Okay, good. All right, is it running on the website as well? Yes. Okay, perfect. All right, sorry about that. Thanks.
great. I'll try to stand back here. This camera set up where I think if I stand like here, the people on the website can't really see me. So if I'm standing really far, oddly far back, it's not because I'm like scared of you. It's so I can try to have the people on the website see me. So first I want to tell you a little bit about public opinion on climate change. So what does public opinion look like? So for many of you, this probably isn't sort of a new graph, but basically it shows that the majority of the public thinks climate change is real and it's happening. But people's views, the people that think that warming is mostly because of human activity is, right around 50%, depending on the poll. So there's not like a strong consensus in the public that this is a big problem that is caused by humans and that we need to solve. Even though a majority of people sort of believe that climate change is real, there isn't a consensus on the next steps. And then the problem is further complicated by the fact that you have huge divisions across partisan lines. Right? So even among people that think that climate change is real, the vast majority of those people are, I have a pointer here somewhere. Yeah, the vast majority of those people are Democrats. So Republicans tend to think that climate change, actually isn't even real, let alone caused by humans. So, this is going to provide pretty obvious incentives for Republican legislators and elected officials that for them to take a sort of pro-climate change position that we need to take action, it's going to be pretty politically risky. And I'll show you a whole lot more evidence along those lines. But that's sort of the basic takeaway. For Democrats, they have pretty strong political support among their people that might vote for them to take action on climate change. But among Republicans, I think there's much shakier support. And in fact, the majority of Republicans oppose action on climate change. So turning from views on climate change, so in order to actually address climate change, we have to pass energy policies that change the nation's energy system. Right? So we can't just legislate on climate change. We have to do something that causes us to either use less fossil fuels, more renewable energy, or some combination thereof. So what explains people's views on energy policy? Well, one is obviously like people's views on climate. If you think climate change is real, you're probably more likely to support renewable energy. And I'll show you some more evidence on that. Second, which shouldn't surprise you considering the graphs I just showed you, is that people's views on climate change break pretty strongly on ideological and partisan lines, particularly in the US. I don't know as much about partisan divisions outside of the US, but in the United States, there's, very strong partisan divisions on climate change. Third are people's economic interests. So we see this most naturally sort of in coal country, where Democrats have just gotten hammered over the last few elections, frankly, in large part because of climate change. Where people that work in the coal industry see the obvious economic threat to them from actually dealing with climate change. And you can see that playing out in elections. So this is the basic map, and I'll return to various shapes, various scopes of this, but this is the basic political map in the US. This is the 2012 election results. So why do I show you this map? Well, in part because people's views on climate change and energy look a lot like this map. So people in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest and California believe in climate change and think we should take action. People in the South basically don't think climate change is real. And to the extent they think it's real, they certainly don't favor any kind of strong energy policy that's going to result in less coal power and more renewables. So this is a basic, you should always have this map in the back of your mind. And this is particularly problematic because what are the places that use the most coal in the United States? Right in here. So these are the places that don't want to get rid of coal, but they're the ones that use the most of it. So partly, they don't want to get rid of it because they use the most of it. But this is going to be a real barrier for any kind of systematic policy. So I'll skip what's sort of obvious that liberals and conservatives have strongly different views on energy policy. And in particular, conservatives basically think the government should stay out of the economy and stay out of the policy realm. But that's going to be deeply problematic for dealing with climate. So in addition to conservatives, it might be that Republicans, don't believe in climate change. But even aside from that, they have sort of strong ideological reasons to oppose regulations that are going to change the energy system. So it's going to be actually pretty hard philosophically to get conservatives to buy into any kind of comprehensive change of the energy system. So I want to talk a little bit more about the groups of people that have economic incentives to oppose and support climate, sort of strong policies, energy and climate, because I think this is a key part of, in order to think about the feasibility of different policies and sort of overcome the partisan divisions, you have to try to think seriously about who are the groups that might favor or support you. So as we talked about, coal miners are going to be strongly opposed to anything related to energy and climate that gets rid of coal power, and really anybody that works in the coal industry. And you can see that very strongly in survey data. It's not particularly surprising. Likewise for people in the oil and gas industry. So once you move beyond the electric power system, what do you have to do to solve climate change? We have to get rid of gas-powered cars, right? We have to move to electric cars or natural gas maybe fired cars. But that's going to really hurt the oil industry, right? So anybody involved in the oil industry isn't going to be so enthusiastic about this. My computer's mad at me. Also, Wall Street isn't going to be so enthusiastic about this because mostly because these oil and gas companies have big stakes in the existing energy system. And so anything that's going to reduce the value of all of the oil and coal that's in the ground, right? Because in order to solve climate, as you guys have probably talked about in other sessions and have probably thought as much or more about than I have, is we need to keep all of this oil and coal in the ground that's there. All of this stuff that's worth hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to investors, we need to convince them or force them to keep it in the ground rather than extracting it and selling it for trillions of dollars. So Wall Street isn't going to be so enthusiastic about that. That's going to result potentially in the evaporation of trillions of dollars in paper wealth. All right, so there's a lot of groups that aren't so enthusiastic about this. Who might be more in support of action? Well, one group that might be more in support of it are people that benefit from renewable energy, right? So this isn't rocket science, but I think that for me, I was an economics major as an undergrad, and I think the way I was sort of indoctrinated to think about policy is to think about it from the point of view of a social planner. So how do we get the most benefit for the least cost? And I'll tell you, rooftop solar is not the cheapest way to address climate, right? Rooftop solar is enormously expensive. So from the point of view of trying to sort of solve climate for the cheapest cost possible, this is an absolutely terrible, terrible, terrible policy, probably. Hope I'm not, none of you are in the solar installer industry. But from the political point of view, this is a terrific policy because it creates lots of middle-class jobs that are based in local communities. And then all of a sudden, all of these guys that are installing solar power in Cambridge now have an incentive to support these new energy policies and to lobby their congresspeople. Whereas for the traditional power system, like coal power does not create a lot of jobs in Cambridge. But installing solar power creates lots of jobs here in Cambridge. Likewise, farmers or landowners are going to be pretty excited about this because they're going to benefit from building renewable energy on their land, particularly in the Midwest that have declining farming values potentially. And then last thing I'd say, beyond the sort of obvious interest groups, I think we have a trade-off because the other thing that we know that matters a lot is that, people are worried about power plants near their house, but they're also worried about cost. So, here in Massachusetts, it's been really controversial, some of the energy policies that Deval Patrick's administration implemented, because many of them raise power costs, right? So we know that in order to address climate, there's really no way to do it without raising energy costs. If you can figure out how to address climate without raising energy costs, then you should get the next Nobel Prize. Certainly not obvious how to do it. But consumers hate that. But the problem is that we know that politically, on the one hand, we want to create middle-class jobs based in our community, but that might raise costs more than other options. So I don't know, there's no simple way to think about that, but I think you want to think about those trade-offs as we're thinking seriously about the kind of policies we might develop, and try to think about what are the policies that are going to maximize the political bang for your buck. Just to show you some more specific policies in terms of what public opinion looks like. So this graph shows you support among Democrats and Republicans for a wide array of energy policies, all of which are designed to sort of reduce carbon emissions. And you can see basically the Democrats support almost all of these policies and Republicans oppose almost all of these policies. So again, like for a Republican politician to support one of these policies, would be pretty problematic with their political base. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to persuade any kind of large number of Republican elected officials to get behind these policies unless you can change public opinion. Because no Republican is going to take a position that 75% of Republicans in the electorate oppose. It's just not going to happen. So this shows a bunch more policies and looks pretty similar. This is some work I did on some surveys that I ran, which shows the partisan divisions on a number of state renewable energy policies. And it looks exactly like the previous graphs, where the blue dots here are Democrats, and the, sorry, I lost my, get rid of the cursor. The blue dots here are Democrats, the red dots are Republicans. So all of these policies, basically Democrats support, Republicans oppose. So now I want to turn back to that graph I showed you earlier of the division in public opinion across geographic lines. So again, this is the graph of the 2012 presidential vote. This is some survey work I've done based on some surveys I've run. And the big takeaway is that this is on renewable energy policies. It's not really important in the details, but basically the distribution of public support looks exactly like red and blue America. Wyoming, West Virginia, Kentucky, Mississippi all hate renewable energy, and basically think we shouldn't do much about climate change. But the reason for that, is in part that they're really conservative, but in part, like the places that are really dependent on coal, like West Virginia and Kentucky, are the places that are most, opposed to action on climate. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is beyond public opinion. You might think like, okay, this seems like a big problem to solve. Also, it's not obvious that changes in public opinion always lead directly to changes in public policy. Another thing that matters a lot is interest groups and social movements. So it sounds like that's what some of you guys are involved in, is sort of trying to build a movement on climate change. So, groups like the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and on the other side of the issue, the Chamber of Commerce, utility companies are all obviously actively engaged. I think one of the challenges on climate on the side of motivating people is that there's a real collective action problem here, right? Like for most people, climate change doesn't actually affect their daily life. But joining Greenpeace or the Sierra Club or a local climate organization, that's something that's going to cost them money. It's going to cost them time. And so it's hard to motivate people, I think, in bulk to do this, as opposed to something like an economic issue that directly touches people's pocketbook. Like here in Massachusetts, we just passed a ballot initiative to raise sick pay. So raising sick pay is something that directly affects you. And it's much easier for the average person to get excited about. So I think it's hard to, building a movement on climate change, like one of the core challenges is just overcoming basic collective action problems and giving people incentives to actually get engaged. Why should somebody actually give $100 to Greenpeace or go volunteer for a weekend of their time? And I think as a movement, we need to figure that out. So the problem is that because of this basic collective action problem, there's an asymmetry on climate change. What are the groups that are most likely to be able to raise lots of money and do effective action? So it's not groups with large numbers of people that aren't affected much, right? So things like consumers, people harmed by air pollution, none of them have a strong incentive to really get engaged on this. Whereas, and so you can see this, that very small people have actually directly contacted government officials on climate change. And I think this number is probably a gross exaggeration, but it's from a survey. So, these collective action problems make it difficult for people that favor climate change policies to mobilize. But instead, the groups that it's much easier for them to mobilize because they have a lot more at stake are things like utility companies, those automobile companies, manufacturers, going back to our oil and gas workers we showed earlier, coal workers, these are the groups with like a huge economic stake. So it's going to be much easier for them to organize on this issue. So it's not surprising that what you see on like the, in the climate legislation a couple of years ago, EDF and NRDC put together like a big group of companies to work on it. And it was mostly composed of manufacturers and energy companies. Because those are the ones that have a big stake on this issue. So I don't want to dwell on this too much. But I think the big point I want to convey to you on moving beyond sort of public opinion and collective action problems, on actually passing legislation in the United States, it's really hard, right? In order to pass legislation, it has to get through a committee in Congress, it has to get placed on the agenda for a vote, which in the current House and Senate, Republicans who don't actually believe in climate change control the agenda. So there's no way to get anything that's actually good for climate change on the agenda in the US House. It is not going to happen while Republicans control the House without a serious change in public opinion on the issue. But even if it did get on the agenda, you'd have to then win a floor vote, which given that, a majority of the people in the House don't think we should do anything on this issue, is unlikely. Then you've got to get it through the other chamber. And the problem in the Senate is you don't just need 51 votes, you need 60 votes. So getting anything through the Senate in the United States is pretty hard. And then you've got to get through the courts, which are also going to take a couple years to sort of figure out whether this passes muster. So at the end of the day, it's very hard to pass legislation. Only a few dozen pieces of legislation pass Congress in a given year that are of any consequence. And really only a handful of ones are like truly important. So it's not that surprising that, Congress basically passes a major piece of environmental legislation every 10 to 20 years. It doesn't happen very often. It's much more of like the exception than the rule. So a couple years ago when the climate legislation failed in Congress, you shouldn't have been that surprised, frankly. Like that's what normally happens. Big legislation typically fails in Congress. Doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying, but it illustrates that this is a tough nut to crack. And in order to get Congress to take action on something, you really do need to build, I think, a very large bipartisan coalition, which we're not at that point right now. So just to illustrate this on the climate bill, right? So the climate bill was like this great constellation of events, right? It was like when Democrats were at a peak of power in Washington, lots of people were in Congress that thought climate change was a big problem. The House was controlled by very liberal Democrats. So they got it to they got it through committee onto the agenda in the House. It passed the House. But then when it got to the Senate, they didn't have 60 votes in the Senate. So even though they had a big majority that supported it, they still needed to get 60 votes. And in fact, they didn't get a single Republican to support the bill. Moreover, because if we back up to the map, you'll see that a lot of Democrats, thinking about the basic political geography of climate, a lot of Democrats are from these red areas that really don't believe in climate change and really don't think we should do anything about it. So, for a Democrat in West Virginia to support a climate bill would basically be like political suicide. So in order to get 60 votes on the Senate, you can't have a map that looks like this. You need to have a map where most states believe in climate change and think we should take action, right? You're never going to get there when only the 20 liberal states think this is a big problem. All right, so I just want to talk quickly about the international problems. I know some of you are from countries outside the US and might be sort of ready to not hear anything more about the US. Sure.
We understand the problem. It's well known. Do you have any insights into how it should be solved?
Sure. I don't know that I have any particularly unique insights, but I think that in the United States, I'll focus just on short-term paths forward. I don't have any particularly unique insights into the long-term path forward. I think trying to get action out of Congress is not worth spending any time on right now. And I think trying to get any kind of strong international agreement is also probably not worth spending any time on right now. So in my view, I think that over the long term, I think, the problem is the science, we need to do stuff now. But, if you back up a step and think broadly about where things are going, I think that climate change is going to get worse. Public opinion is trending in our direction on climate change. Or, people are more worried about climate change over time. Moreover, interests are changing. I think that over time, as more renewable energy gets built, and and also, frankly, the rise of natural gas sort of kills coal in many respects, I think the economic sort of constellation of interest is changing. So I think that in 5 to 10 to 15 years, it's going to be much easier to pass comprehensive legislation than it is right now. So I think at the federal level, I think it's not going to pass anytime soon. I don't think we should give up hope. So I think over the long term, things are moving in our direction. Much like if you looked at the polls and looked at the politics of gay marriage 5 or 10 years ago, things on gay marriage looked terrible 5 or 10 years ago. Most states banned gay marriage. You can only get married if you were gay in 1 or 2 states. But you can see that over the past 5 or 10 years, things have really changed substantially. And I think in large part that's because of the change in public opinion that's happened. And I think climate change, while not quite as extreme as gay marriage, does look something like that, where the majority of young people think climate change is a big problem and think we should address it. So as you start to have generational replacement, I think that more and more of the public is going to be in favor of taking action on climate change. And just to illustrate that, this is a poorly labeled, it's an unlabeled graph, but it shows public opinion by age on a bunch of different energy policies. The blue dots are young people, and the red dots are people over 65. So you can see that young people are dramatically more in favor of a broad array of renewable energy policies than older people are. But in the short term, before we get this kind of shift in public opinion, I think that, frankly, that the 2 most likely paths for action in the US are regulatory action. So we should be if you care about climate, you should try to get Obama to do everything he can right now and then try to get a president in 2016 that cares about this. Not because they're going to be able to pass comprehensive legislation that solves the problem, but because, frankly, without comprehensive legislation, regulation is probably the best we can do. The downsides of regulation, though, are that it can be overturned by Congress, right? So if you have a really conservative Congress that doesn't believe in climate change, then they can really stop the president's ability to do regulations through the power of the purse, right? So Congress can essentially defund any ability of the president to take action on climate. And we're already seeing that with some of the Clean Air Act stuff that Obama has tried to do. So I think having a conservative Senate in power now is likely to make it much harder for Obama to take really an active stance on climate. I think the other path forward is at the state level. This is maybe one thing I would have changed in my presentation today. So Republicans winning in a bunch of states yesterday is going to make this a lot harder than it was 2 days ago. But still, there's a bunch of states where there's either Democrats in control or there's even actually some Republicans at the state level, I think, that are in favor of renewable energy. Mostly because it actually helps their state economically. So a place like Kansas or Texas is really good for wind power, right? So the economics for wind power there are really great. And so what you see is this boom in windmills in Kansas and Texas, which may or may not be good for the overall ratepayers, but are certainly good for farmers and economic elites in those states. So I think what you should think seriously about is what are the kinds of policies that states can pass, and how can we push the ball forward as much as we can at the state level? They're not going to be able to do everything, but there is sort of a range of policies that states really can, I think, if you really push the ball forward, can make a lot of progress on. That both make a lot of progress on their own, but also serve as examples in the long term. So I'll stop there. I have more things I could say, but you guys have been talked about a lot today. So thanks. So I'm happy to answer. I don't know what the best format is for this. I'm happy to answer questions related to your proposals or to policy and politics more generally. I wish I came here with clear answers on the path forward. I think, again, if I had that, I'd probably get the Nobel Prize along with one of you. Yeah.
Well, I don't know about the Nobel Prize, but our organization every day is working on a path forward.
Great.
We're probably the only organization that actually speaks to every single Republican office on Capitol Hill regularly about climate. And a question that I always have about these analyses is, what tells us why, in private conversation, the vast majority of those offices are populated by people, including the elected officials, who totally understand the problem, know that they have to do something, and are terrified that the moment is going to come after which it'll be too late for them to be part of the solution.
Yeah.
And yet, when you organize those individuals into a political party and you get their supporters providing incentive for them to take action, it seems to be, when you look at the numbers you're showing, that everybody's just assuming, well, people will never get it, so let's just pretend that it's smart not to manifest these views that we have and take action. There's really no logic to that position politically. Money is not a good explanation for it. Long-term electoral viability is not a good explanation for it.
These guys aren't thinking about long-term viability. They're thinking of getting to the next election cycle, right? So next election cycle, so Mike Castle's, my favorite example of this. I don't know if you know who Mike Castle is in Delaware, right? So Mike Castle was if you believe in climate, was like a great Republican, right? This is like, our platonic ideal of a Republican. He was like, very, very active on not just believing in climate change, but I think he voted for the climate bill. He was like active in supporting it. So he lost a Republican primary almost entirely on this issue, because I was in Delaware at the time. So he got hammered on his vote on the cap and trade bill by a frankly terrible Republican candidate. Like Christine O'Donnell was a terrible, terrible candidate. So if Christine O'Donnell could beat him on climate, then basically any kind of like an actual good Republican candidate would have just creamed him. So all of these Republicans are worried that's going to happen to them.
What I'm interested in, though, is how, we spend a lot of time talking to people about the actual economic effects, not the perceived economic effects. We talk to them about how they can actually follow through on their promises to constituents.
Right.
Follow through on rhetoric. So when you have conversations about what
details.
Yeah, can you hear? Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
So when you have conversations about what actually would flow from a good policy, everybody gets interested in good policy. And what I see happening a lot is the two parties don't know much about how the other party thinks on this issue. You talk to people who see the same people every day down the hall, and they haven't had a real conversation about this issue in 3 years.
Yeah.
So they're getting their news about their own colleagues through Fox News and MSNBC, and they have a much more radical view of each other than reality would allow for if they engaged more. Is that something that you can measure through public opinion? I feel like public opinion doesn't know anything about that.
Yeah, probably not, but I think you have to do both. I think that legislators, they care about what's good policy, and talking to them about the policy implications are important. But they're not going to, when almost 60% of Republicans don't think climate change is real, there's just no way Republicans are going to come out on this.
But that's not even true. They'll tell you that they don't believe climate change is real, but 60% of the smart people do not believe that climate change is not real.
Republicans in the public? No, you're talking about elected officials.
Yeah.
So elected officials, I don't have a strong view on what elected officials believe in their heart of hearts, but from our point of view, it doesn't matter what they believe in their heart of hearts, right? What matters is how they vote in Congress. And, at the end of the day, they are never going to support a climate bill when the numbers look like this. So, you have to persuade them that there's good policies and they can adopt. You have to change the politics of the issue as well. So I think that's what you've seen on same-sex marriage, right? Where in same-sex marriage, there's been, both. I think people have done great work thinking through the policies and how we can, what policies you could actually adopt. But the politics have just changed dramatically on same-sex marriage. And you need to have something like that happen on climate too, to create the opportunity for you to do great good work to persuade them on the details of the policy, I think.
Could I follow up to that?
Sure.
Just a minute? So, do you know about an organization called Results?
No.
So our organization, Citizens Climate Lobby, borrows its model from Results. And Results, they did the same kind of work, organizing citizens to lobby Congress on poverty, hunger, and disease. And at the time when the Republican Congress was slashing funding for everything, even defense, they actually increased funding for the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria to record levels, and for the first time ever gave a multi-year commitment. And that was because the volunteers from Results were not only talking to Congress, sitting in their offices and having real respectful conversations, they were also writing op-eds and letters to the editor. They were doing outreach events. They didn't convince everyone everywhere that this had to happen. And they didn't convince the people in Congress that everyone everywhere thought it should happen. But they convinced them that it was the right thing to do, and there was a political atmosphere in which doing it would allow you to be celebrated and not doing it would make you look bad. And there was no need to wage a campaign or threaten anyone. It was just, it became evident from the ongoing contact and from the fact that newspaper after newspaper was putting that same message out. So that's another question that I have. In the way that we organize, if we were to spend our time doing what 350.org does, which is a global messaging campaign to the general public, we would never get anywhere on our work. So there are other groups that they do that work well, but what we see happening in the actual dynamic, in the conversations between decision makers, is that the change in the general public's views doesn't have a huge impact unless the general public is actually responding to something. So for instance, with same-sex marriage, the view of the public evolved as the policy environment evolved. As more states got legislation through or more court judgments came down on the side of marriage, then the general public started to open up to it more. Is that something that you find as well?
I think it's a research question, right? So, you know, it's an empirical question, right? So if that's true, then the states that have adopted RPS policies, you should see a shift in public opinion, you know, on the side of climate, right? And to my knowledge, it's not actually true, but it might be. I mean, I might be, I've never studied that myself. But I think that's the kind of research I think we would need, because I think it's a reasonable hypothesis. Like, oh, we changed policy to make it more renewable energy friendly, and over time, that itself will shift public opinion. But I think if that's a hypothesis, we should go out and actually test that with data before we build organizing campaigns around it.
There's one last question. I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but you know, we have a carbon pricing policy, and the reason for it, and the reason we have a lot of conservatives who support our particular approach, is that the climate problem is really various problems. The true problem is an economic problem. The climate change problem is a symptom of it. When you're not paying the right cost for the resources you're using, you're adding massive amounts of cost to everything you do. So if you just institute, you know, feed-in tariffs or RPS policies or installation funding, it can be expensive. If you don't actually fix the underlying economic problem, then you're not quite getting that boost that you see with, for instance, same-sex marriage, where you're actually fixing the problem, and now people say, "Oh, the sky didn't fall." Right?
Yes, I don't disagree with you as a policy matter. I think as a political matter, my advice would be the opposite. So as a political matter, I think it's going to be a decade before you get Republicans in Congress to support any kind of comprehensive approach on climate, and I think it's just a fool's errand in the short term to think otherwise. However, I think that probably you could. So I think what distinguishes the policies you're talking about from climate is that on those policies, they're not going to lose a primary for supporting them, right? Whereas on climate, like Mike Castle, who had an approval rating of 70% in Delaware, could lose a Republican. So if Mike Castle can lose a Republican primary to Christine O'Donnell, it'll happen anywhere. Whereas if they support a little more funding for tuberculosis, that's not going to get them a primary challenger. So I think what you need to think about are what are the policies that will make a difference on climate that you can argue are good policies, but will not lead them to lose a Republican primary. And I think that's not a comprehensive policy. It's things like, you know, energy efficient light bulbs, which of course even, you know, in the last couple of years have gotten like much more politicized than they used to be. But nonetheless, I think that's the kind of policy, like, you know, obviously that's not going to solve the problem on its own, but it's the kind of thing I think we could actually get done in a partisan fashion. And then if you're right, which I certainly hope you are, that passing more of these policies will ultimately help us shift public opinion, you know, hopefully there's like a snowball effect. If we start passing, you know, little tiny incremental policies, we start generating the political shift that we need. Yeah.
So I was just going to mention a note on our political model.
Sure.
And yet, I'm pretty loud. I was just going to mention another political model, which was the medical marijuana model, which is exactly the same kind of model that you're talking about, where there was a decision made by a group of individuals, which started in California in 1996, who got passed the first medical marijuana initiative. That was funded by some pretty major funders. And then the group, I should say the silo that was working toward this issue as a political policy, looked at it and said, oh, if we take the money and the resources that we have and break it down state by state, we will have the opportunity to shift people's thinking as well as shift the policy. And I believe that that is what happened. And I think with each subsequent state, they changed and reshaped the law so that it kind of went like from medical, which was the only thing that in 1996 could even get passed in California, to changing it and shaping the legislation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's exactly the right way to think. Like, we're not going to get legislation in the next 5 years. So really, realistically, in the U.S. politically, this is a 10 or 20-year fight. And so how do you build that kind of momentum over 10 or 20 years? And maybe you can start doing that with state legislation. There's probably other things you can do, but I think that's exactly how you'd want to think, like the medical marijuana people did in '96.
It's interesting because, especially when I come from the developing countries, I would have expected something different from the way you people think, people from the developed countries. But one of the problems, like in our countries, or in my country, I come from Kenya, is that people don't even understand these things. And a good example would be given of smoking. People know that smoking causes cancer. Yeah? And despite that fact, they continue smoking, isn't it? Yeah? So you can imagine a scenario like when we have climate change, we know very many problems about climate change. We are going to get, even our crops, many things are going to go wrong because of climate change. But if people don't care about smoking and they continue smoking, and they have seen people with cancer, very miserable, what about a case like this, which they don't even understand? Yeah? Yeah. So sometimes I teach at the university and I teach environmental education. So that's why I'm interested in the whole thing. But even the students I teach, even the ones doing masters, they don't believe. Some of the things they just run because they have no choice and they want to pass. Sometimes I ask them, why are you doing this course on the environment? And the thing is, they are doing it so that they get a degree and then they're able to get a job. Not because they really care. So my feeling is, probably what the people should be doing, the ones who understand about climate change, is to get ways probably to go around so that they can show people good things which they would want to use. For example, if we can use the coal, the energy, it can be made expensive, if there can be a way of making it expensive. And of course, it's not clean. You see, it has many disadvantages. So that way we can reach what we want, but not because we are going to eat from people. Yeah? And even when we are talking about the big people, the people who make policies, not that they don't understand, but like now, what they want to be voted in. So they cannot make policies which will make them become unpopular, and that sort of thing. And we have many things, like in our country, people are told do not cut the forest because it's wrong to cut the forest. But really, they don't care. The late Professor Madai had a way of doing it by working with the small people and showing them the benefit they would get from the forests. So that way, they could get the forest as carbon sinks. You see what I mean? So, yeah. But, I got here, it's easier. Because it's very easy for you. Because most of your people, they're educated. You can imagine in developing countries. Yeah. Majority of the people, they don't even understand.
Well, I think that if you think over a longer term, I think two things you said that strike a chord with me are if you start to think over the 10 or 20 year time horizon that this is going to take probably, you have to change people's minds, and that's going to come through education in large part. And in large part, probably education of younger people, because that's where it's easier to change people's minds and educate them, right? Once you're older, it's hard, right? Like you sort of have this is the way I think the world works. The other thing I think comparing to smoking is interesting, right? So on smoking, why was it that public opinion shifted actually pretty rapidly in the United States and probably in other countries in terms of they still smoke, but I think most people sort of get that smoking is bad for you, in part because you saw people die from it, right? Like you can sort of see, you can sort of observe, like, okay, like I think like in my own family, 3 of my 4 grandparents smoked. All 3 died of smoking-related diseases. So you don't have to have a PhD in statistics to think like maybe there's a causal connection here. And I think that even for people in developing countries, like that's probably you can sort of see the logic in front of you. Whereas in climate change, it's like much more abstract, right? So it's not nearly as obvious. Like how does this affect people I know? And it's hard to tell people. Like I think so what some recent research I saw showed on same-sex marriage is like, what's the most effective way to persuade somebody on same-sex marriage? It's to say, I'm gay and I want to get married. That's how you change opinions. Whereas in climate change, like what's the analog to that? What is it that is like that personal? It's hard to think of it, right? But I think that's where we need to go, is to think of that kind of like personal, make this personal for people.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you were discussing before about local politics here in the United States and trying to connect that internationally.
Sure.
I wonder, and I would like to hear your opinions on that. Seems like there is an endogenous issue here where, the local politics and tie that to economics and winning elections and so on. And I mean, internationally, we're talking about the famous next COP or meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is going to happen next year. And everybody is pushing about that, which is going to take place in Paris. And I wonder how much of that, I mean, I remember from a few years ago when Al Gore was, part of the previous conversations and then came here and then Congress didn't pass the kind of international agreement. And I wonder, and kind of hear your opinions on, what's the feeling nowadays towards that? Is that something, I mean, in my country is quite relevant, is you hear everybody talking about it in all things. Maybe I read too much around that, but it seems like there is momentum for that. But, elections yesterday and all these local, story you're talking about here about local politics seems like maybe that's not. And so I wonder, you have pressure from the grassroots, pressure from the companies, and I wonder how much is that role of the international policy pressuring United States or local legislation or legislator here? Is that sufficiently strong enough nowadays that maybe, or still we are gonna wait another 10 years like your previous hypothesis?
Yeah, I don't think so, sadly. I think that in the United States, it'll be 10 or 20 years. Just the same reasons that we can't pass legislation, the United States will not ratify a treaty on climate. So even if you can get a great liberal president that believes in climate change and signs a treaty like Clinton did, the Senate won't ratify it. So any kind of treaty, I think, is a non-starter for the United States. So I think what I would be doing if I was, involved in the international negotiations is trying to think of non-treaty routes, more informal agreements. In particular, informal agreements with at the end of the day, like 5 countries pollute 90% of the greenhouse gases, right? So it's those like 5 or 6 or 7 countries that we really need to get at the table and committing to a deal. But that doesn't need to be a treaty. That could be a much more informal deal. And then just like I suggested that I think comprehensive legislation is hard, I think you need to start small. And probably even Kyoto was too ambitious, right? So getting baby steps where people can start to feel comfortable and see the earth isn't, the sky isn't falling because they did this. But of course, it's hard. I say that as a political scientist, and I get that that's totally incongruent with the challenge of the science. So I don't know what to do about that. But speaking as an academic political scientist, I think it's a hard problem, and I think it's we're just not going to reach a political solution in the next couple of years. That solves the science.
What do you think of Ms. Gillens and Page?
Their argument that government is more responsive to the rich, or what's?
Correct, the flat line.
Yeah, so I don't believe the research. Sorry, but I think their research.
Did you say they frauded the research?
No, it's just complicated. It's a very complicated issue to study. So it's not that they did anything wrong or anything like that. It's just that it's a very complicated issue to study. So I'm not actually sure the hypothesis is right.
So you're saying the government does respond to people, that the Congress does respond to the average citizens?
Yeah, I mean, it might be that Congress is a little bit more responsive to the wealthy, but at the end of the day, members of Congress want to get reelected. And, they're not, so think about like, the most voters in most states are poor middle class. So if Congress people only responded to the wealthy, they wouldn't get reelected.
Well, but that's not true. That they basically showed that you're more likely to win if you have more money, and 95% of the elections, more money wins. So then you don't need to go again.
It's a complicated question.
But it's a real tragedy if you're talking about even trying to educate and raise the number of people who are interested. Like, he's very concerned with lobbying Congress. And what he said was really chilling, right? He's going in and he's finding the congressman saying, look, I really understand this. And then they're turning around and pressing the red button on the bill because of Gillen's research, in my opinion, or something like that. Well, I agree with you, and I'd like to see that argument taken more seriously, not just completely dismissed, because big money in primary elections will 95% chance will get Republicans out of office. And I don't know if that's what happened with O'Donnell and in Delaware, but I know it's happened in other places.
So I shouldn't have dismissed it so quickly, but this is an active controversy in political science. So there are papers, frankly, with very good research designs that cut in both directions, including theirs. Like, I think theirs is very well executed and very well done, but it's just not the last word on this subject. Yeah, there's some that find no difference in responsiveness across income groups. In part, so here's like the core thing, just as more of a general thing outside of climate. But on most issues, rich and poor people actually don't have dramatically different views. So on most issues, the difference in public opinion across income is relatively small. It's not to say it's zero. I mean, generally poor people are a little bit more liberal. They're not a lot more liberal. And so, so to think like, so how would I know that government is more responsive to the rich when actually their opinions are not that different? So think about it from that point of view. It's like actually a very difficult thing to study. And it's hard to think about what does that mean substantively. If you and I have basically the same views.
But certainly if you talk about taxes, which is something that's been a policy decision for hundreds of years, at least since 1913.
Yeah, so it's another complicated thing. So most Americans, for instance, support the estate tax, or oppose the estate tax rather, support the Republican position on the estate tax, right? Most Americans supported President Bush's tax cuts. So it wasn't like only rich people supported these tax cuts, that like 99% of the benefit went to rich people. Now, we could have a long conversation about like, why is it that many Americans supported these policies that hurt them? But again, like, it's not that politicians are only responding to the rich when actually most people supported those policies. Yeah, but I'm happy to talk more. I think it's a really important normative question. Just on campaign spending, so there's very modest evidence that campaign spending has a big impact on election outcomes. And if you actually look at observational evidence, people that raise more money tend to lose, right? Because why do you raise more money? If you're an incumbent, when do you raise more money? Well, partly, but you raise more money when it's a competitive election that people worry you might lose. So if you look at observational evidence, the correlation is actually negative between raising money and winning. So even when you try to tease out, like, causally, why is it, if I just randomly, Alex, so imagine that I like randomly get some Congress people more money, which is like the thought experiment you should have, right? Like, how does that affect election outcomes? Well, the best evidence is that it very slightly increases their chance of winning, but not by a lot, and mostly because there's just a lot of money in politics, right? Like, Democrats in this last election were not outspent in aggregate. They raised just as much money as Republicans. So, it's not like Democrats got walloped yesterday because Republicans outspent them. Now in Massachusetts, Coakley got like dramatically outspent, right? So in Massachusetts, probably money did play a slight role in the Baker victory. But on the whole, I don't think that explains like the aggregate results we see.
So you're saying really that the people are much more controlled than what I seem to be getting from what he's saying or the Gillen study?
Well, actually, I'd like to I wasn't insinuating that people aren't actually in control of what's being thought. I don't know why it is that I'm saying I don't know what the mechanism is that says that members of Congress may hold the view that they should act and then not do it. It probably is their vision of the political landscape. But in our experience, people engaging with elected officials is the single biggest driver of their actions. The more engaged they are with people, the more they tend to do what those people want. Do you find
So
that,
here's what you should do.
well, I just wanted to ask this question to you about that, which is,
Yeah.
when people who have money are the ones who are the most engaged, they're going to have a much bigger influence over the elected officials because they're bringing not just ideas, but also leverage. But the much larger number of people who don't have as much money, if they engage and they bring ideas and leverage, they tend to have a bigger influence because it's people. And there is the vote count itself, but there's also just the human impact that this is a person who's there to do a job, not for money, but for citizens.
So here's what I would love to see, which is an experiment that I don't know has been run, but I would love your organization to run, is you should randomize which Congress people that you lobby. So randomly lobby half of Congress, don't lobby the other half, and then we can study what are the difference in outcomes. Like, do they support the bill more often, right? And if so, like, how big is the impact? And that would be terrific, right? If we could show that lobbying is causing Congress people to support the bills, then that would be terrific. So I think that's the experiment that you should run. And you uniquely, sounds like you're uniquely positioned to do it because you have all of these citizens you're working with, you're lobbying on lots of different things. That would be terrific, I think, both for thinking about climate change, but also more broadly for thinking about how people can influence members of Congress.
Actually, what we have, so we have over 7,000 volunteers, but we have only one policy we lobby on. And what we do is they all build relationships and they talk about the local impacts, the personal stories, they connect, they learn how the member of Congress, how the staff think, so they can help answer their questions and bring them resources. But I don't know that we can do a randomized study like that because we're in relationships with all these legislators, but there definitely is a trend in our experience, which is the more education on the one thing we deal with, the closer they come to supporting it. So you see, for instance, there's a decisive trend where certain elements of our proposal have been working their way into carbon pricing legislation.
That's great.
Right? Behind the scenes, something else is happening, which is there's a need for the people who are politically vulnerable to find a safe place where they can communicate with each other and where they can communicate with their rivals also. For instance, one of the things that we always worry about is what's the role of partisanship among supporters of action in making the action more difficult to achieve. So if you have a real partisan split on an issue and the champions of that issue are extremely partisan, we keep seeing that actually hurts the policy.
I believe that. I think that's probably right. Yeah.
That when you have champions of an issue who are so extremely partisan that they won't even consider that the other party actually has people who think like them and could work with them, and
yeah,
it creates a divide. So you see in country after country, in Canada, in Australia, across the European Union, as that is happening more and more, their ability to implement policies like this is getting harder. Right?
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
No, they're right. Create a lot of evidence.
I think more generally, I mean, the evidence on persuasion is that the more you think somebody's sort of like you, the more likely they are to persuade you. And if I'm like a very liberal activist and I walk into a Republican's office, right off the bat, they're going to say, like, this guy is not like me. There's nothing he says that I'm going to believe. So I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and I think it sounds like really terrific work. I guess one thing I just say, going back to my early pitch, making this pitch to all of you guys as like leaders of advocacy groups and education groups, is do randomized experiments. Like, the way to learn about this, and the way to, particularly on climate, we don't really know what works. Like, how do we persuade people? We don't know. The way to learn is to do randomized experiments. And that's how we're going to make progress, I think, on figuring out the strategies that will solve the politics of this. No, not that I know of, particularly on climate. I don't even know of, I don't know of studies on other things, but I couldn't say for sure they haven't.
Okay, so you said that this is something we should do. Do I hear that you're volunteering to provide some?
I would be happy to partner with anybody that wants to do that and provide my expertise. Yeah.
They have one issue. It's pretty hard to randomize.
Well, you could randomize at the state level, right? So if you lobbied so you're based in DC?
I'm based in New Jersey. Our organization is all over.
So you could lobby the New Jersey state legislature, right? So you don't have relationships with them, but you could decide like randomly, we're going to try to build relationships with half of them.
Would you two be willing to work together to come up with the study that you just volunteered to help?
I am happy to work with you or anyone on that.
That would be great. You might get a Nobel Prize. Definitely. You get good data out of that.
Yeah.
Game over.
Yeah, but I think, broadly, like, given that we don't know what works, I think we should all be working together to try to figure out what works and how we can make progress.
I agree. I mean, I think that's the most ridiculous thing about policy, no matter what position you're in. No one tries anything, right? It's all top-down, sort of, we know what we're doing. I would love that approach.
Well, what you've seen, this is actually really interesting. This is, still a little bit of an aside from climate. But what you've seen in the political context in elections over the past 10 years, it used to be that advocacy groups would think, in order to win this election, we really need to like contact everyone in Cambridge, and we can't not contact everyone in Cambridge, so we might lose. So it's the same kind of strategy. Like, we have to lobby everyone in the legislature. That's the only way to win. And I think what you've seen in electoral organizations over the past decade is, as randomized experiments have really taken off, is that they've realized that in order to learn about elections and how they can do better in the future, you have to have a control group, right? So you have to agree, like, there's some people in Cambridge we're actually not going to contact this time, because that's the only way we can see what the treatment effect of what we're doing is. Yeah, in the long run, it saves you money. In the short term, in reality, it turns out that for elections, at least, usually you can't actually contact everyone in Cambridge if you don't have enough money. Just like for most lobbying organizations, they actually don't have enough resources to talk to everyone in Congress, probably. There's probably a very small number of organizations that really are talking to everyone in Congress.
That's great, though. I would love that. If you guys did it, I would go volunteer. That's the data I would want. Well, you're getting volunteers already. What a tremendous idea. What was the study that you mentioned? Gillens and Page. So these guys came out, I think it was April of this year. They've been on Jon Stewart. They've got a lot of attention for a paper basically showing that the economic elites control policy and the average citizens have a zero response rate. You have others like Bartels, the Bartels study 2005,
I do.
which shows that the low income groups have negative response from Congress. And the elites, especially on the right, Republicans, have an enormous response from Congress. And what he claims, so I don't know if you followed the discussion after that, is that there's lots of studies that
This is a controversial area of research.
mitigate it.
Yeah, with no consensus right now on the findings, I think it's safe to say.
They've got a lot of attention for that.
They have. I think it's good for political, it's good for social science, it's good for political science, to people to be out there making big claims and trying to
Another big rock star
show them.
this year that I followed is Thomas Piketty.
Mhm.
His stuff, too.
Yeah.
Where he gathered all the data from tax records and showing this G is greater than P and massive inequality increases.
Very cool.
Can I go back to the idea that you were connecting all these with energy? I mean, at least that was your analogy. I don't know if it works with other sectors as well, the solar and also the coal. Is it really there, the area where we need to work? I mean, even with all these, is around that sector? I mean, I don't know, it seems because that's from the jobs, so it's jobs, it's economics. But on the other side is, you might lose, I mean, again, this connection that you were saying is more like fuzzy, where are the impacts, like floods. And I think a couple of years, you have a big ones here in New Jersey, at least. Here there was a big storm. People start connecting all these things with climate change.
Oh, Hurricane Sandy.
Sandy
Yeah.
years ago, and then Katrina several years ago.
Real
People
sweet.
connected that, yeah. And so what I'm wondering is the connection works the same way or really not at the other side,
Yeah.
the area of impacts. So here is the causes, here are the.
I think you should work on both sides of it. I mean, I think, both you need to convince people that climate change is more real and, there's like big impacts. But I think a barrier for most people, I mean, if this is going to hurt me economically, then like cognitively, I'm just going to like convince myself it can't be true, right? If I work in the coal industry, like, you can show me as much evidence as you want. At the end of the day, I'm going to be like, I don't really believe you, because if I do, that would cost me my job.
Right. But
So I think you have to work on both sides.
people were whatever it is, the coal industry. Sure, I understand if they don't suffer that, I understand that they still won't get complete. I wonder, and maybe you have the answer already, what happened with the people here where Hurricane Sandy was affected? Did they start swinging their...
I don't think, to my knowledge, it caused no change in public opinion, but I'm not going to claim that I've studied it in depth.
No, as just a regular person, just watching people talk, I feel like for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
people were more curious about the possibility of climate change.
But that's it.
And that's what you see typically.
Everyone went back to work a couple weeks later, and it was as if it never happened.
Yeah, that's exactly what you see when there's like these big, so you saw the same thing with the oil spill in the Gulf. You saw the same thing with like Exxon Valdez in the early 90s, right? Where probably like a blip in public opinion where it shifts for like a month or a year and then it drops right back down.
I think what she said is really valid, right? I spent a lot of time living in Italy, and you know, there's Mount Vesuvius, live volcano, and you've got people from Napoli moving to the suburbs and building houses on this volcano that's expected to blow.
Yeah.
Right, she's talking about cigarettes. I'm talking about a volcano where, like, you go like 4 miles down, and they show them all frozen as they're running, like they're all, you know, magna-made statues, right? And they're like, oh, the house is cheaper there. You know, it's crazy. People are funny. We're optimists.
That's also, you know, in New Jersey, New York, this problem of building on the coast. You have an ocean. People don't understand what happens when an ocean comes at you. They expect it's like waves lapping on the beach, but it's not. It's the pushing of this massive force that cannot be stopped by anything we can do. They just ignore that threat, build there because that's what they want. To me, it comes back to the work that you are doing in the area of when you have a conversation about what people are willing to believe, for instance, on science or on the viability of alternative energy. When you start to talk about policies that would actually create a good economic outcome in that same community, the resistance to the other stuff starts to go away, even though you never talk about it. Do you find that kind of, have you been able to measure that, or? It's not saying,
my own research doesn't typically focus on the causes of public opinion. I focus more on the effects of public opinion on policy. But I totally believe that would be true. I can't speak for my own research.
I'm sorry, because from our perspective, what's interesting is that there's a connection, there's a kind of feedback mechanism between politicians and the public. Politicians are often the ones teaching the public, however inadvertently, however clumsily, by campaigning or by giving press conferences.
Yeah.
The public are teaching them what is safe for them to do. And so if they're the ones delivering that message of viability to their own electorate, it should make them safer politically.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that there could be a virtuous cycle where if you can change public opinion a little bit and make it safer for moderate Republicans to start talking about this issue, then they can sort of cause it to snowball and continue to change. You have to sort of create the initial conditions, I think, for them to feel safe talking about it. But there's lots of evidence that elected officials do change public opinion when they talk about things as you're saying.
Here's what you got to do. You got to find a study or invent it or something, put it online, so that it was a Republican and not who's the big left guy who does the innocent whatever inconvenient truth.
Al Gore.
Al Gore. So instead of Al Gore, you find some historical footage where this Republican guy was claiming it first, and they look right, and we look wrong.
I mean, you can see a little bit the limits of this, though, right? Like John McCain. Speaking of Al Gore, like John McCain was actually pretty out there on climate change in like 2004, 5, 6, 7, and basically gave up because he just hurt him politically. I mean, so if John McCain, who was like the consensus, future presidential nominee of the Republican Party, couldn't change public opinion dramatically, it does show that you can do it, but it's hard.
What is your direct research on?
So my research is on representation, which is the link between public opinion and political outcomes.
So that's Gil, right?
Yeah, my research is similar to what Gillen's and Page do.
Opposite results? What do you, it seems like you're finding.
I haven't myself looked at income variation by income, but people that co-authors of mine have, and find almost no difference in responsiveness across income groups. The difference you find, so one of the challenges, and I can just geek out on this a little bit, but another challenge, in addition to the fact that income groups don't typically have preferences that are all that different from each other, another challenge is that, so well-educated people, like probably most of you, have like very defined beliefs, right? Like you go to school, you get educated, you talk to lots of smart, educated people, you sort of, in the course of conversations, you come to very clear beliefs about the world. The Problem is that generally low income people, they have vague beliefs, but like we don't know that much about climate change. And so they have like a vague notion of what the government should do. But if you ask them like, what should the government do on like a carbon tax? Basically they're going to be like, that's a good question. I don't really know. And so how do you take that sort of noise into account? And so one of the things that people have found, so one of the things that explains a lot of Marty Gillen's findings, arguably, and was what other research has found, is there's just more measurement, we call it measurement error for low-income people. It's not that they don't have attitudes, but like they're just, on any given survey question, if I ask you a survey question, there's going to be more like randomness. And then if I put that into a statistical model, it's going to look like there's less correlation between their opinions and elected officials, but it's only because of the measurement error in my measurement of their opinions. So that's part of why this is like a thorny thing to study.
And how do you gather your data? Do you do polling as well?
I do. So for my research, I've aggregated basically every public opinion survey that's ever been run. So I have data going back to the 1930s on people's opinions on a wide variety of public policy issues. And then for a lot of my data, I break that down at the local level. Because what I'm interested in is if Vermont gets more liberal, does public policy in Vermont also get more liberal? Is Vermont more likely to elect a Democratic governor? Are they more likely to have a liberal legislature? Yes, but modestly so.
Which is scary.
Yeah. I would say it depends on your belief. I think, a lot of people think the government is like not responsive to the public at all, right? So depending on like your prior, I think, government is responsive to the public, but is it very strongly responsive? No.
But that's what we want. We really want our representatives to walk into Washington and kick some parts, right? We really want them to bring what we want. And when you find moderate curves, then to me, I'm curious. I'm not a big fan of referendums, but we have to get closer to that direct line.
Yeah, I agree. This is exactly the kind of research I do, is what institution. So a lot of the research I do is actually on what institutions sort of improve democracy. And do term limits. Do things like direct democracy or term limits improve responsiveness? So I think these are exactly the questions that, broadly speaking, I think we need to answer.
Yeah, and I think this comes to the part of where we want our politicians to act. We want them to be leaders. We don't want them.
I agree.
And so there's this great mass of people who don't have very informed opinions.
Right.
And
Representative democracy.
right.
Yeah.
We need that. The problem is we have a class of politicians who are willing to do anything to stay in office.
Yeah.
And when you say anything, they'll promise favors. They'll say, look, if we build the Keystone Pipeline, we'll put 50,000 people to work.
Right.
And there's another class of politicians who are not willing to exaggerate or make false promises. So they say, well, actually, the number is we're going to put about 100 to work full time. And they're not willing to say, if we build the Keystone Pipeline, we're going to put 10,000 people out of work.
Right.
And so there's an advantage on the side of the politicians who are willing to make false promises and tell falsehoods. And that makes it really tough. So there's a great need for people like us and like you to do some fact checking.
Yeah, I think just I agree with most of what you said. I think just to clarify it, I think the first part is just true. Like, politicians want to get reelected. This is the one motivating thing of all politicians in the world, right? They wouldn't be in Congress if they didn't care about getting elected to Congress. And the fact that they're still in Congress meant that at some point they cared about getting reelected. So, in general, I think a good assumption is that any elected official in a democracy wants to get reelected. That's just the way it works. But I think that, it doesn't necessarily mean they should be able to lie their way to reelection, right? So our job as sort of citizens and as advocates is to make sure that if they lie about Keystone Pipeline, they should pay an electoral penalty for that. You should make it so that it's in their electoral and it's in their electoral interest to not lie about the Keystone Pipeline. That's not necessarily incompatible with a reelection incentive.
Punishments are great.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, exerting. Yeah.
But yeah, I love that. Who's that guy? There's a guy named Jonathan, someone down in North Carolina studying punishment. Right? And people are more willing to join the system if there's penalties for misbehavior.
Yeah. Any other questions I can answer before we wrap up, or anything about your specific policy proposals that, yeah?
So you said that politicians are only moderately responsive to, so what else are they responsive to? Are they just like more?
Yeah.
Status quo?
Well, I think there's two things to keep in mind. So you might think that ideally we'd want politicians to be constantly like thinking about public opinion in their district and like repositioning themselves. But in fact, that's mostly not what we observe. So most of representation happens through what we call selection, which is that a liberal district tends to elect Democrats, and conservative districts tend to elect Republicans. It's not that Republicans like Democrat, you get elected and then you're like constantly repositioning yourself. And it's not entirely clear why that is. I mean, one thing I think is the public doesn't like that, actually. You tend to get punished if you're like repositioning yourself. So mostly the way we get a government that's responsive is if the public gets more liberal, they're more likely to elect Democrats. And if they get more conservative, they're more likely to elect Republicans. So you can see how over time, that does mean that if you're in Massachusetts, it's a liberal state, you tend to get more Democrats than Republicans in office. And maybe they're weakly, in some very weak way, trying to reposition themselves to what the public wants when they're in office. So that's you can see how over time that's going to mean that government in Massachusetts is going to do more liberal things than conservative things. So public opinion sort of gets translated into policy, but it's not a particularly strong or immediate signal, right? There's a lot of noise in that signal. Yeah, which is why I think just realistically, again, I wish this wasn't true, but speaking as a political scientist, people in office, except even on same-sex marriage, most Republicans in the House still don't support same-sex marriage, despite the sort of massive change in public opinion. So in reality, people in office tend to not change their opinion. They tend to not change their positions very significantly over time. They particularly don't shift from being really conservative in an issue to really liberal very often. So, if you care about climate change, how do you get Congress to pass policies that you support? Well, ultimately, you should try to elect people that believe in climate change. That's going to be a much more direct path to getting action than trying to persuade lots of people that don't believe in climate change to believe in it. I think, it's, again, speaking, as a political scientist, I think it's unlikely that you're going to persuade very many people in Congress to change their opinion significantly. I think, the best course, if they already believe in climate, you're trying to persuade them around the margins to support energy efficient light bulbs. I think that's doable, right? Persuading them on a particular policy that they don't really have strong feelings about, but persuading somebody to become move from a conservative to a liberal on an issue. It just empirically, we don't see that. Looking across lots of different policies, so not just climate, we observe that very rarely in practice. In fact, there's a famous quote that a political scientist studying Congress and studying thousands and thousands of roll call votes over time said that members of Congress, quote, die with their ideological boots on, which means that whatever ideology they had when they get elected to Congress, typically they have when they die. It's by some scholars called Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, who are probably the most famous people that have studied the history of roll call voting in Congress. So their opinion is that there's they would say if pushed that there is zero ideological change among Congress people. I don't actually think that's true. I think Congress people do change a little bit over time, but not much. It's around the margins. And it's probably why Democrats just got walloped in the South, right? If it was easy to reposition themselves ideologically, then you would have seen Kay Hagan reposition herself to be more conservative so that she could get reelected. Right? So part of why, you can sort of see in action, how this is pretty hard to do. If it was easy to do, then, Mark Pryor in Arkansas, he's no idiot. He knew that, he was about to get walloped. And so, ideally, he should have gotten, a lot more conservative in his roll call votes. But, it's not easy for these guys to do for a variety of reasons. So, thank you.
Their former supporters would punish them.
Exactly. So there's political downsides to that. Exactly. Exactly. So just in climate change, if a Republican were to say, previously said climate change was not real, comes out tomorrow and says, I think climate change is real and is a big problem. In the next primaries, people are going to say you're a flip-flopper on climate.
Flip-flopper. So you lose your present supporters, and you go over to the other camp, and are they going to suddenly love you?
Exactly. So historically, so another issue that political scientists have studied is what happens when politicians switch parties. And what happens is they almost always lose, right? So like another option for Mark Pryor in Arkansas, who you guys know him, he's like a conservative Democrat that just lost re-election for the Senate in Arkansas. So another obvious thing that Mark Pryor could have done, like why didn't he just become a Republican? Well, because Republicans would have been like really pissed off if he like suddenly, you know, tries to tell everybody he's a Republican, right? So that's generally a losing strategy. Exactly, the Democrats would have hated him too, so like everybody would have hated him. So, all right, thanks guys, this has been fun.
Thank you.